presenters on the list. Now, anyway, Professor Werner is online, Lena Kochmann-Sill, so is another colleague of us, and never mind, we're looking forward to field work done by Konrad. Before you start on that, you have to come up with an article for Letterpiece, of course, but don't forget about the article for our conference. Anybody else as well, where we discuss that, yeah. So, yeah, then the floor is yours, and please ask questions thereafter. Yes.
Hello, Dr. Jane. I think most of you here know me in some capacity, so I don't have to introduce myself. But for those online, perhaps, my name is Konrad Szymanowski. I am a Fulbright student, guest studying at the University of Leipzig. I've been here since October, and unfortunately, my time is drawing to a close. But in that time, I have had the honor and the privilege of conducting an independent research project here in coordination with the Institute of Sorbian Studies, as well as other institutional bodies in Lusatia, specifically Lower Lusatia, looking at institutional coordination in the Lower Sorbian Revitalization Project, essentially looking at all of the partner organizations, whether they be political, financial, cultural, or educational, that in some capacity deal with the Lower Sorbian language and the Lower Sorbian people. So I did introduce this project originally back at the conference in April. So if you attended, you may have seen the beginning stages of the project. This project is not yet at an end, but most of the data that I have had to gather in person has been gathered. And I will spend the rest of July and August refining my article. I still may have some interviews coming up. This is a qualitative interview project. I will explain the methodology later. But for the most part, all of the relevant data has been gathered, and I am currently working on data analysis. So I also hope to hear your input. Some of the points may be still unrefined. That's completely intentional. I also want to hear from people who work here who have expertise in this field. So the background is quite scant, mainly because I also trusted my audience to know a little bit about the Sorbians working at the Institute for Sorbian Studies. But essentially, when we talk about institutions and institutional actors, we are looking in large part at language planning and language policy. This includes, for minority languages, many different moving parts, but for the most part, this includes three main general categories, that being the minority itself, so the people that comprise the minority ethno-linguistic group. We have a lot of intermediary activists and advocates, so people who are in some form or fashion connected to the minority group, but maybe do not consider themselves part of minority or work in some other fashion with them, rather than identifying as part of the minority. And state institutions, so these are formal, well, sometimes informal, but largely formal bodies that deal in some way with the minorities' issues, whether that be educational, so setting up language schools, financial, setting up different museums or cultural associations, or legal, so looking at judicial frameworks involving the rights of the minority language. In Europe, there are quite many linguistic minorities, and so these types of bodies are quite frequently encountered. Less so in other parts of the world. For example, there has been a lot of news out of China recently, because China is cracking down on their ethno-linguistic minorities to a greater extent than they have in the past. And that's because there are very few regulatory bodies dealing with the democratic rights of an ethnic or linguistic minority in a non-democratic state. Luckily, in Germany, we have a democracy. So we have bodies that deal with the Sorbians, both the upper and the lower, as well as the other legally recognized minorities in Germany. Now, within these three main groups, you have obviously coordination on some sort of scale. You have the people that are involved, you have the people who are involving themselves, and you have the people in between who are talking between the two. This type of institutional coordination is quite vital so that funding can reach proper sources, so that relevant programs can be effectively set up, so that the interests of the minority are represented and passed down generationally. However, in my both of my experience here in Leipzig and Lusatia, as well as my research prior and during my time here, I found that this coordination is relatively lacking for the Sorbian people, which was surprising given the fact that Germany, among other European countries, is considered to be quite bureaucratically organized vis-a-vis its minorities. And it is in a party to the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages, which cannot be said for countries like France, for example. And so that you would expect the prime ideal conditions to exist here in Germany for a minority like the Sorbians to be supported and to be thriving. The evidence we have, of course, contradicts that supposition. So in proposing this project with Professor Dr. Asmus, I was very curious about why this institutional coordination seemed to be lacking. And I wanted to know whether there were specific structural, political, or financial conditions or constraints that might hinder greater cooperation in this regard between various organizations and groups. Especially in sustainable language planning. So a large part of my project is looking at, for example, education, especially higher education, or the lack thereof in Lower Sorbian. But initially, this project actually started out looking at interest groups, which was a very, very relevant direction. But over time, with interviews that I've conducted and with the research that I've done, I've looked more at the institutional network overall rather than individual pressure groups. But those do still play a big role in looking at Lower Lusatia. One of the really interesting facets of this project is for a minority that is ostensibly so small, why are there so many of these groups? Of course, we have the Domovina, which is the overarching umbrella association. And for most people who know anything about the Sorbs, that is probably the only organization that they are really familiar with. But either included under the Domovina or associated with it are countless myriad other organizations and groups whose purpose and function is not often clear or at least delineated from one another. So there are a lot of overarching Venn diagrams, if you will, of people who have a vested interest in revitalizing the Sorbian languages, but who really can't always articulate how their program differs from the program of a partner organization. And so you have the situation where a minority that is really quite small, because the Lower Sorbians, the upper estimates are the lower thousands. The more realistic estimates are probably in the hundreds of people who are fluent Lower Sorbian speakers. Upper Sorbian is only slightly better off, but the same goes there. In fact, they have more organizations because they have a stronger demographic base. So there are so many of these organizations really that I kind of lost track. I still find new programs and projects every day. And yet it's not really clear what they're always doing, how they're interacting, who's responsible for whom, who's managing what projects, where the funding is coming from, where it's going to. All of these things are not as well defined as they should be for a minority that has suffered declines in the number of speakers since the reunification of Germany in 1990. So those are kind of my motivating questions, and they still remain at kind of the heart of my interest behind these organizations. So the project that I conducted and conducting is really quite simple structurally. It's a qualitative interview analysis. I wanted to look at the people who partake in these programs in some fashion, or people that are involved in the Lower Sorbian community, primarily looking at this middle group, so these intermediate activists and advocates. Although I did also want to include voices from the state institutions, and in the future I would like to work with the minority itself, but that's a topic for another time. In this project, it was really dealing with the people who are involved actively in some way with the Lower Sorbian language and people, right? So I did my research and I found people who I believed would be good contacts. And at the beginning of this year, I sent out very, very many messages and emails to at least 35 people who I thought would be perfect contacts. I did send emails out to more people, but we'll get to how successful that effort was in a minute. The people that I reached out to were, as I said, mainly people, often middle management, for example, at these different projects, people who were managing smaller focused groups, such as Sroka, which we'll talk about in a minute, but also looking at representatives of state institutions, the Minderheitensekretariat in Berlin, but also the various bureaucratic organs of the German federal government that have dipped their toes in the Sorbian language project in some way. But also educators and researchers located in various parts of Lusatia, mainly Cottbus, because the focus was Lower Lusatia. But I also wanted to understand the relationship between Lower and Upper Lusatia as well. As I've mentioned, and as most of us know, there's a demographic imbalance between the two Lusatias, between the two Sorbs. And so I wanted to understand if this demographic imbalance also had a relationship on the way that the organizations dealing specifically with either Upper or Lower Sorbian interact with one another, even with things like funding, for example. So the interview protocol that I created and lined up had approximately 15 to 20 questions depending on who I was speaking with. And the interviews ended up lasting on average 45 to 50 minutes. They were designed to be between 30 and 60. I believe the shortest interview I had was 27 minutes because that person was in a rush. And the longest I had was over an hour and a half. Unfortunately, that was quite a pain to transcribe, but I did get a lot of good information out of that interview. So the number of people that actually I ended up having interviews with thus far has been 12, which is not ideal, but it does illustrate, I think, sort of the underlying difficulties with working with minority groups, especially as an outsider. Many people that I spoke with, for example, initially expressed interest, but then responded back with more cautionary responses and ended up declining a formal interview. Of course, these interviews were structured in the sense that they had to receive formal ethical approval, and not everyone felt comfortable doing so or being recorded, for example. So a lot of the interviews simply could not go through because people were very reserved about speaking about their work, about their position, about their opinions. Many of these people are Sorbs themselves, so being a small community, everyone knows each other. That is one of the things that complicates any research in any minority, is that at a certain level, everyone knows each other, so whatever you say will eventually come back around to you, not necessarily in a positive light. So it really is like stepping on landmines. You do have to be careful. But the 12 people that I did get to speak with me were largely independent researchers in some fashion. There were a few other project participants, so people who were employed at an institution. I had one person employed at a library. So these project participants were in the demographic that I was seeking to represent and to get to know more from, even if it wasn't necessarily the representative spread that I was hoping to get at the beginning of the year. After I interviewed the participants and I transcribed the interviews, I coded for thematic analysis, essentially looking at commonalities across all the participants' responses to the protocol. And these three themes that kind of look at answering what are the issues with institutional coordination have popped up time and time again. There are other minor themes, which I will discuss towards the end. But looking at a fundamental lack of institutional coordination at higher levels, which is essentially just answering the whole question, what is going on with the coordination. Also looking at a cyclical nature of approach to project planning, but what I mean by this is essentially that a lot of programs and projects are going in circles. They're looking at patterns that have been used in the past and that really have gone nowhere, and then essentially reinventing it for the new decade. So there is sort of a stagnation in innovative approaches to different programs. This is changing with Strokan, which I've attended some of their meetings, and so there is progress on this front, but it's not perfect. And so that kind of pattern does show up and up over again. And the final one is the issue with the Lower Sorbian language education system, which has also changed in the time that I've been here, because we'll get into it, but there is actually some development on that front as well. However, that doesn't deny the fact that there is a great shortage of teachers teaching Lower Sorbian, speaking Lower Sorbian really fluently at the highest level necessary to teach it. And so you have large gaps in the educational system, especially regarding a abundance of programs for children and a relative dearth of programs for older, well, teenagers, young adults, and adults. So, throughout my presentation, I will. This is a lot of text. I apologize. I know that it's more interesting to look at graphs and pie charts, and I do have some of those, but I'm still developing them. However, I did want to include some interesting quotes that I think illustrate a lot of the main analyses, the themes that have emerged from this project. So I think what sums up the lack of institutional coordination planning in total is the second report from the Ja Zatewie project, which was a precursor to SROCA from 2020, which says no institution or government agency participating in the network, meaning the network of institutions involved in Lower Sorbian language, has drawn up voluntary commitments specifying which measures fall within its area of responsibility, which it could undertake, or which it plans to implement. In other words, I believe 10 out of 12 participants said that they did not feel there was any sort of organization to the overlying revitalization project. There are individual programs, such as the Vitai program. There are things like Zoria. There are countless many more of these, but there isn't necessarily a clear hierarchy to who is responsible for all these projects. There are associations. There are, generally speaking, I am responsible for this person, and after that, I'm not quite sure. But as participant number 9 said, nobody's sure who's responsible for what. There is a lot of overlap. By the way, nearly all of this is translated from German. German was the primary language of the interview process. I have been learning Lower Sorbian, but unfortunately not enough to be able to conduct formal interviews in it, notwithstanding the fact that most of my participants could not do that either. So there is a slightly unfortunate irony in that fact. Yes, the Minderheitensekretariat in Berlin is the government agency within the Bundesministerium für Innen that is most directly responsible for the the national minorities that are recognized by the German federal government. So they are theoretically the person that dispenses funding to the Stiftung für das Sorbische Volk. And they are theoretically the body that is the most strongly associated with the Sorbian people from the point of the federal government. To that point, participant 4 said, technically, they are responsible for all of us, meaning all of us minorities. But I've never interacted with anyone from Berlin. Beyond funding, they're somewhat passive about specific projects or strategies, which I think is a fairly effective way of illustrating that, at least from the state government side of things. There seems to be no visible or tangible sense of coordination or cooperation. Coordination does happen between different organizations, like I said, die Stiftung für das Sorbische Volk, Domowina. These are the primary bodies that do reach out or do organize different projects with, for example, the Sorbisches Institut, with different museums, with different Kulturvereine, which I think there are 11 in Upper Lusatia and 5 in Lower Lusatia. So the coordination does happen, but it does not really happen on part of the federal government. They take a very hands-off approach. In fact, one of the latest announcements from the Minderheitensekretariat was simply an announcement from the Domowina that the Domowina feels that the Minderheitensekretariat does not care enough about their schools in Upper Lusatia. So that the Minderheitensekretariat should look more into encouraging the Saxon government to care more about the Sorbian language school system. If that tells you how complicated or kind of convoluted a lot of the announcements or really initiatives on part of the federal government towards the Sorbian people are. then I had done my job. So, yes. So in terms of effectiveness slash cyclicality, what I mean by this essentially is that a lot of these initiatives, and there are many, many of them, are not necessarily as innovative as other counterparts across the European continent. And I mean, not as innovative. They are trying to be. There are definitely attempts on part of these organizations to breathe new life into a lot of these programs. Zoria, for example, is one of these recent projects that, when I discussed Zoria with some of my participants, they were mostly positively oriented towards it, even if they did acknowledge that it's quite a small start, because Zoria is only, I believe, 10 people? 10 people? So it's quite small. It's a very healthy step in the right direction, but it's quite small. And for the pre-existing larger programs, there is sort of a sense that every 10 years they just redraw the logo and slap it on the same old product. So for example, the publicly available online Erste Bericht der Landesregierung zur Lage des sorbischen ländischen Volkes im Land Brandenburg from 2017 versus the second one in 2024. The second one, quite literally, has a statement in the first, I think, 2 pages that says, if nothing has changed relative to the first report, we will not talk about it on this report. Which I suppose is a time-saving measure, but it's not necessarily helpful to outlining what actually has changed in the, 7 years between the first and the second report. One of the more interesting aspects that I am still kind of researching is how exactly the new project Sroka is different from the earlier project Yo za Tebie, which essentially, for those who are not familiar with either Sroka or Yo za Tebie, this is a grassroots initiative organized by the Sorbisches Institute in Cottbus, which is looking to advocate for a greater education for adults in Lower Lusatia, in Lower Sorbian, and looking to encourage the greater use of Lower Sorbian in society. So it's looking especially at helping parents who want to either learn Lower Sorbian and teach their children, or they want to support their children who are going to language immersion schools, for example, the Nina Sorbisches Gymnasium in Cottbus. It's looking at funding more initiatives for public Ausstellungen, for example, in Lower Sorbian, in Lower Lusatia. Some of the things that have popped up in the meetings that I've been to have been things like increasing the number of signage in Lower Sorbian across Lower Lusatia, not just on individual streets in Cottbus, for example. There have been a lot of proposals, and they have their protocols are published on their website. So I encourage everyone who's interested to look at those as well. But it is this Sroka, which first of all it's very early stages. I believe it's only been started last year, and they are reporting, I believe, that they will finish with phase 1 in 2027, and will implement phase 2 through 2031. Which seems a little bit like the Stuttgart 21 timeline for me, but I understand it is quite difficult to implement a lot of these new changes. But it's built a lot on the back of Yo za Tebie, which is essentially a very similar project that began back in 2013 and went through 2019, I believe. In fact, a lot of the documents on the Sroka website essentially say, our previous documents are based on this Yo za Tebie project. Which Yo za Tebie was very helpful because it was also not a census, but a survey gathering data. They interviewed some Lower Sorbians to gauge what the community itself thought about different initiatives that the Sorbisches Institute that Domowina had undertaken in years prior. So that was actually also a very big resource. But looking at these 2 projects, Sroka is more ambitious in scale, perhaps, because they are really aggressively undertaking, especially these past 3 or 4 months, they have really aggressively been meeting and workshopping, brainstorming. You can see a lot of the fruits of those efforts on their website, or if you go to their meetings. But there aren't as many structural changes to their approach. And from what I have seen, many of the assumptions of Sroka are difficult to implement in reality, as difficult to implement as any prior initiative in this direction, because it's a lot of brainstorming. So they're not at a stage where they can talk about concrete, finite initiatives for teaching people to speak Lower Sorbian. This is, I think, going to work out for them, at least I hope, because as I said, they're doing a lot. But as it stands now, I'm not sure how it's different, and that is something that has been echoed by a lot of my participants. So participant 6 said there are a lot of meetings and statements with different people, so meetings with different people from different organizations across Lusatia, but I wouldn't say that much has really changed in the last few years, which is really true for all of Lusatia since, again, the 90s. There hasn't been a focused, realistic strategy to increasing the number of Lower Sorbian speakers. And so we've seen the number decline. We don't really have a proper number for how many people are left, but there are studies that say 100 people. There are studies that say 4,000. That's not really a range that we can work with. And so it's difficult to gauge really how effective many of these initiatives have been or are going to be. Yes. Finally, this one, I think, and I would like to look at this further in my research as well, but the language education system for Lower Sorbian is also a point of discussion and a point of interest for most of my interview participants. So Lower Sorbian is offered as an immersion language in the Niedersorbisches Gymnasium, and mainly as a language of study in other schools across Lower Lusatia. There are not many of these programs available relative to, comparative to Upper Sorbian. But one of my interview participants, participant 3, said, education for children in Lower Sorbian is fine up to a certain point, but higher education in the language is very inadequate, and I think that affects how many teachers we have and how well they know the language. The shortage of teachers is actually a well-documented phenomenon, and it's present very much so in Upper Sorbian as well as Lower Sorbian. That was part of Domowina's recent complaint to the Minderheiten Secretariat, is that we don't have enough teachers to teach Upper Sorbian. Lower Sorbian, it was the same way, especially because there are very, very few native speakers of Lower Sorbian left. And part of the sentiment that I also received from some interviewees was that there is a marked difference between someone who has learned the language and someone who has spoken the language since their own childhood, and then how they go on to teach the language. Language change was something that was addressed here and there in the ways that people, especially older people, maybe don't argue, but they have a different opinion about the way that Lower Sorbian should survive compared to younger people who are at these meetings for Soroka as well, for example. So that is actually quite a point of discussion, and it comes up later. But one thing that has popped up with higher education, up to this point, the only place that one could learn Lehramt for Niedersorbisch was Uni Leipzig here, the Institute of Sorbian Studies. Recently, there has been recently, meaning I believe the winter semester 2026, 2027. So this next winter semester, they will start the Lehramt Primarstufe, das Zweitsprache Sorbisch-Wendisch at BTU Cottbus Senftenberg, which will essentially it has the stated goal of producing teachers for kitas, for elementary schools and gymnasia in Lower Sorbian. So again, there is movement in this direction. And this has been quite celebrated in a lot of the media. Recently, there have been several articles looking at with people that are quite high up in the Sorbian Revitalization Project that are praising this effort. One thing that I was curious about, because I didn't really see confirmation from anyone who works here, is that they explicitly said there will be cooperation with Universität Leipzig, the institute here, regarding teachers for Lower Sorbian. I could not find evidence to that suggestion here in Leipzig.
It's a lovely joke, isn't it?
But it was in the articles, so I can only assume that it is in some fashion true. Yes.
The paper has a political demand, so they have to come up with this.
Yes, exactly. So the question mark. But the general issue with the way that people see education is that there is a very strong emphasis on K through 8th grade, for let's say. Immersion is a popular option, but it's not always effective. Specifically because you often have Lower Sorbian children and German children who are learning Lower Sorbian at the same time that they're also speaking German. And so you have a very big effect of, at some point, children stop speaking Lower Sorbian because they're in the presence of someone who doesn't speak it as well, or someone who is only learning it, or someone who has a different relationship with the language than they do. And so there is still a very big issue with self-esteem in the Lower Sorbian language community. And this kind of asymmetric bilingualism means that while there are many Lower Sorbian speakers who are personally bilingual, there is no societal bilingualism in Lower Lusatia. Very, very few people speak both German and Lower Sorbian with equal fluency in Lower Lusatia. So these issues come up. Then also when you have an increasing number of students that drop off from either immersion or learning Lower Sorbian in its entirety, to the point that you have very, very few students coming to either Leipzig or any other institution to further their knowledge of Lower Sorbian or pursue research in that, or a career using Lower Sorbian as a language of everyday use. Which in turn leads to a shortage of teachers for Lower Sorbian, and then the cycle renews itself. You have fewer teachers, so you have fewer spots, and so the cycle closes itself. It's unfortunately a dilemma that many minority languages have to deal with, but it is particularly extreme in the case of Lower Sorbian. These are additional quotes that I thought were interesting and illustrative of other aspects that popped up, not in the majority of times, but at least a strong plurality of times in my interviews. So one that I thought was just quite funny because it illustrates a lot of the symbolic issues with the Sorbian language community in general in Germany is from participant 11. At these meetings, I've often heard how ethnic Sorbians speak to each other in German. What does that show about communication between different institutions that are meant to promote the Sorbian languages? So again, there is this, I believe it's in the next slide, or the slide after that. There's a culture of politeness, is what it's called, but it is essentially hiding Sorbian away from outsiders, from people who do not speak it or are still learning it to the point where it's not used at all in many public settings. Even students of Sorbian who expressly have gone out of their way to learn Sorbian, either lower or upper, and try to interact with Sorbian people using Sorbian, will often receive a remark of, it's easier if we just speak in German, let's speak in German, or it's considered something that's personal and something that's familial. Upper Sorbian especially is still quite strong in the familial sphere, less so in the Lower Sorbian sphere just because there are fewer families that speak Lower Sorbian. But because many people have a preconceived notion of what a language symbolically means to them, it means they are often less willing to use the language with other people, which of course is the whole point of language revitalization, is encouraging the use of the language in the greater public sphere. So, participant 8 said, regarding the questions that I had about the differences between Upper and Lower Sorbian institutions, many Lower Sorbian institutions are simply small departments of organizations based in Bautzen. I wouldn't say that Lower Sorbians feel prioritized in these groups at all. This points to something that is quite, I think, sometimes not necessarily ignored, but not thought about actively, which is that Lower Sorbian is much, much more endangered, relatively speaking, than Upper Sorbian. I mean, I think based on the current data that we have demographically, Upper Sorbian will probably survive to 2100. I am not quite sure of the same for Lower Sorbian. And looking at simply the ethno-linguistic vitality of both languages, Lower Sorbian is clearly in a much more dire position. And so if you were to ask me, an outsider, that would logically warrant more resources going towards trying to put Lower Sorbian on life support and then actually rebuild it. That is not necessarily the case. And many times my participants said that also logically speaking, because there are fewer speakers and the organizations generally speaking are smaller, Lower Sorbian institutions are essentially outgrowths of Upper Sorbian institutions. And there's not necessarily a sense of being taken advantage of, but there is maybe a sense of the Lower Sorbians are kind of left to their own devices. You do you, and then we are the big people. We will do what we feel is necessary for our people. So there is this divide, and oftentimes Lower Sorbian is called the minority within a minority, which is, yes, quite unfortunate to say the least. But these are aspects, again, that have popped up. So I'm hoping to also maybe include this aspect of analysis in this article and future research. So I added this morning because I've been sitting on it, and I thought that it was perhaps in response to some of my interviews and the questions that I have been posing, since I have been at the Sorbian Institute and I have spoken with some people involved. But on the 18th of June of this year, so 2 weeks ago, there was the second meeting of the Sroka Advisory Board, the advisory board being made up of members of the Stiftung für das Sorbische Volk. And here is a direct quote from that meeting, which is, various Sorbian strategies and concepts are currently under development. One question is whether coordination is needed with regard to the respective target groups. The advisory board is of the opinion that we should not expend unnecessary effort in this regard. It would be desirable to know which institution is working on which concepts and to be kept informed of the results. And we must prevent a situation where a concept that contradicts the developed language strategy then has to be implemented top-down by Sorbian institutions. The state strategies are generally unproblematic. State strategies referring to the Landesplan of Brandenburg and the Mehrsprachigkeit concept, which essentially looks at promoting not only Niederdeutsch, Plattdeutsch in northern Brandenburg as well as Niedersorbisch in southern Brandenburg, but also migrant languages and a general multilingual society in Brandenburg. These strategies are considered unproblematic. I'll get to in a minute. In this context, consideration should be given in the long term to consolidating the language-related strategies or the processes for updating them. I would not agree with this statement. I think it's interesting that the advisory board considers the state strategies generally unproblematic, when in one of the meeting protocols for Sroka, I believe that same week, but on the 11th, stated that the participants of Sroka do not necessarily agree with the Landesplan. They consider it to be a top-down initiative, and that they would rather produce their own initiatives that align with the state strategy. So this is a direct contradiction to what the members of Sroka themselves believe, at least in my analysis, in my interpretation of this quote. Again, this is translated from German, so maybe my translation is off, but the spirit of it is essentially saying, there is no problem, and maybe in the long term, we should think about looking at a coordination strategy, which to me seems questionable at best, mainly because for any language minority, you want to have a clear strategy for how you actually intend to support the language and to support its growth in the public sphere. And this seems to say, we're just going to keep tabs. But that is my opinion. So, some future vocations and surprising aspects that I found in my research. For example, funding, which I think financially, when you think about supporting minority language, finances are often the problem in many places. That is certainly the case for a lot of indigenous programs in the US, where funding is the main problem. They would love to better support the language, but they do not receive enough money from the federal government to do so. In my responses, in my interviews with participants, funding is not a problem, but it is not as prominent a problem as would be expected, and generally is seen as something manageable. It's not the main issue. because, as I mentioned earlier, the German federal government is actually quite generous when it comes to handing out funds for various cultural and linguistic initiatives for its minorities. ABB Brandenburg recently broke the story that this year, the Stiftung für das Bayerische Volk will receive 5 million euros more for this year, and that this total funding will also increase each year until at least 2030. So from the perspective of most of my participants, of course, everyone could use more money, but they are quite well funded for the things that they need to be doing. The issue is actually more where this money is going, how it's allocated. It's not always necessarily clear to which programs, which Vereine, who's receiving this money and how much are they receiving, and where these aspects are not necessarily as clear as many participants felt that they should be, given that this is federal money. So there has to be a line of accountability. Thank you. So these questions that I think are interesting is what would more effective fund channeling look like? So essentially, how would these participants think this money could be more transparently allocated? And also, again, there is something that some of my participants mentioned is that they don't want to suggest that they have too much money. Again, every minority needs a lot of support. So it's not necessarily that they think that they are receiving too much, it's simply that they think the way that it is allocated to be reformed. So there's this delicate balance between the federal government, which generally speaking is not doing so well at the moment, with the very real need to be more pragmatic with the way that it is channeling funds towards different purposes. These last two notes are issues that I have had a conversation with Dr. Asmus about. And also, just generally speaking, I think a sort of worrying paradox is the heart of all linguistic minorities, which is voluntary/passive language shift. So in groups that get small enough to where the ethno-linguistic base is no longer as viable, how effective can these institutions, especially when there are so many, be with achieving their goals with minoritized communities? The concept of linguistic suicide, which is sort of a misnomer because language does not kill itself, its speakers kill the language. And more often than not, it is a result of colonialist, imperialist efforts that suppress a minority over many centuries. But still, the concept of linguistic suicide, whereby a linguistic minority voluntarily gives up its language for one reason or another, pops up here as well, mainly because when we look at concepts of the rule of politeness, so as I said, people voluntarily stopping to use the language in public because of the prestige associated with it by non-speakers living in the same region. And the overall issue of asymmetric societal bilingualism, which is essentially, as I mentioned, that Sorbian speakers are fluent in German and Lower Sorbian. German speakers are not usually fluent in Lower Sorbian or Upper Sorbian for that matter. And so almost by the force of practicality, Lower Sorbian speakers simply stop using Lower Sorbian in almost all contexts outside the home, because it is not practical for them to walk into a bank or a pharmacy or a city office and say Dobry dzień instead of Guten Tag. So you have this unfortunate shift where many people feel that their language does not have as much value. And for what they deem to be practical benefits, simply stop using it. They stop passing it down to their children. It becomes what I would call Küchendeutsch, which has multiple meanings, but oftentimes in US heritage language studies, it refers to a language that essentially is only active in one very specific domain. So in this case, the domestic domain. Lower Sorbian has no longer any practical use with formal concepts, with things like academia. A lot of the vocabulary doesn't even exist yet, or if it does, it's so seldom used that most people don't know about it. With a variety of fields and domains, the language is simply just not being used at all whatsoever. And so however many institutions they are that are trying to keep the language on life support, is it to what extent is it viable, and to what extent is the language community itself a little bit not at fault, but there's a responsibility towards their own language that I think is being discouraged by the conditions in which they have to operate daily, which is living in Germany with German neighbors in a German language environment. My final note for this presentation, as an outsider, generally speaking, the Sorbian community is very divided. Divided along many lines, in a way that I think doesn't really help anyone in this situation. Even in the Soroka protocol from back in February, the fourth note out of 5 that they made about general things to keep in mind going forward is die Sprachcommunity braucht Toleranz, which in this case means there are many debates and disagreements about what direction the language is going, what words young speakers are bringing into the language, the status of things like slang, different pronunciation, the dual form. So these disagreements about how the language should evolve, as well as ideological differences between many Sorbian speakers in the community. And this note essentially saying, there needs to be a tolerance of a diversity of standpoints if we want the language to survive. So I think that sums it up quite nicely. And I don't think that I've seen that happen on a scale where the language has a realistic hope for revitalization to this point. But that is my presentation. I am at 45 minutes, so I did not go too long like last time. Thank you very much for your consideration. As I said, many of these points are still they're still working theories. I'm still refining a lot of my points. But I hope that at least there are topics for discussion, and I look forward to your comments. Nice.